In this video, I'll demonstrate using basic ASP.NET Forms-based authentication in your AJAX-enabled application. Let's go ahead and fire up Visual Web Developer Express, say create a new website. Now, because we're going to use authentication, the first thing that we're going to need to do is enable the kind of authentication that we're interested in. So I'm going to choose the website menu and go to ASP.NET Configuration and click on the Security tab. And the first thing we're going to do is set the authentication type. You notice that it's currently set to Windows authentication. We want to use forms-based authentication for this internet application. So I'm going to change the radio selection to from the internet, which means we're going to set up a database. Now, I'm going to use the defaults and let Visual Studio create a SQL Express database for authentication here in my Visual Web Developer project. But if I wanted to, I could use a externally downloadable tool to set up a configuration database in any SQL instance that I wanted to. So in our case, we're just going to take the defaults. I'm just enabling roles, and then I'm going to say create a new user, and we'll call him Joe User. I'll type in a password that meets the strong password requirements, and I'll do that twice. And enter my email address and a security question, and then I'll go ahead and create that user. Now if we go back and browse to home, you can see we've got one user in place, so we're ready to go. If we refresh the folder, you can see that it's created an MDF file here in my app.data folder. And that's where the authentication information for our forms-based authentication is going to live. Let's change the title of our page here to be Login AJAX Demo. For organizational purposes, I'm going to grab a cascading style sheet that we can use just to center align things here in our application. So notice there's nothing special in here, just doing some center alignment and some widths for standard items, just for clarity in visualization. So the first thing that I want to do from a programming perspective is to add an instance of the script manager on my page. So let's go into the toolbox, down into the AJAX Extensions tab, grab an instance of the script manager and drop that on the page. Now, we're going to be going against some built-in functionality, basically, that's provided by the ASP.NET AJAX extensions. And on the client-side libraries, there is a sys namespace that includes a services.authentication service object. And that's what we're going to be using to program against, to use the standard ASP.NET authentication mechanism, but be able to call it in an AJAX way. So to begin with, we're going to have to create some JavaScript to call that login function, and I'm going to do that. I'm going to place that in a separate scripts folder in my application. Now, you don't have to do this. I just like to keep things as organized as possible in my solution. So I'm going to create a scripts directory, and then I'm going to add a new item that is a JavaScript file, and I'm going to call this ASP.NET AJAX Services. Now, in our case, we're just going to be programming against the authentication service, but in an app that really made good use of the ASP.NET services that are provided, you could be programming against roles or the authentication service or anything that you want. So we might build this ASP.NET services.js file into sort of a full-featured utility class for interacting with the ASP.NET service methods. So here, we're going to start with a function to process the login. So we'll create a doLogin method. And my Toshiba laptop is being unfriendly with keyboards today, so I'm going to switch keyboards quickly. All right. So let's call this doLogin, and we're going to need a username parameter and a password parameter. And inside our do login function, we're going to call sys.services.authentication service .login. Now, we don't have IntelliSense for the sys.services namespace at this point because it's not referenced anywhere, but trust that the entire sys namespace will be pulled down by the script manager, and since we're going to include this ASP.NET file into our default.aspx page, which now has an instance of the script manager loaded into it, all of the appropriate objects will be resolved. So here inside our authentication service login call, we need to pass in a whole collection of parameters. The first is going to be the username and then the password. And the next parameter is a persistence indicator, which basically tells us whether or not we want to persist the login credentials across browser sessions, etc. And we don't want to do that unless we really know that there's some reason that we should, because we just want to keep things as secure as possible. The next parameter is specifies an alternate redirection URL. So after the authentication process, do we want to go to some other page? In our case, we do not. The next parameter is just basically is a no op that's reserved for future use. And next, we need to provide, since this is an AJAX style service method call and it's therefore asynchronous, we need to provide function references for the asynchronous returns. So we need a successful and a failed function reference. So we're going to provide an on login complete function, which we haven't written yet, but we will momentarily, and then an on authentication failed function, and then we provide a user context object, which can just be any text we want to put in there. And we're not going to actually use this, but as you'll see, it gets propagated, so you could it can be useful. Now we need to implement those functions. So let's say function on login complete. And we'll flesh these out in just a moment. I'm going to say function on authentication failed. Okay, so on login complete, we've got some parameters, and the first is going to be a credentials object. So then we're also going to get the user context. Right, so it might be useful to, particularly in a multi-user environment such as a web application, it might be useful to have a user context. We're not going to use it in this demonstration, but it's there for your use. And the method name. Now, when we hit this method on login complete, that means that the sys.services.authentication.login service method completed successfully. Doesn't necessarily, just the fact that it returned doesn't mean that the authentication necessarily was successful. So here in our client-side code, we can check valid credentials and see if valid credentials is equal to true. And if that's the case, then we can take some action client-side here. So we might display on the user your login was successful in the user interface, or we basically could take any action that we want. We might choose to change the content or do a redirect or whatever we like. And then, of course, if things didn't work out, we might choose to take some other action telling the user that their login attempt failed. Right? So And just for the purposes of this demonstration, we're not going to take any client-side actions based on this, but understand that this is how you can check in your JavaScript code to see whether or not things were successful. If things weren't successful, we want to do something. In our case, we'll just pop up an alert. You probably don't want to do that necessarily in your own application, but so we'll just say authentication failed with this error message. And then, of course, we need the parameters that will contain that. So we're going to say error object user context, which is useful for debugging these sorts of problems, and then the method name. And now I can add the error object's information by calling error object.get message, since it's the message that we're interested in. Okay. Okay, so now that we've done that, let's go back over to our default.aspx page, and here inside our script manager, we're going to need a couple of references. So the first thing that we're going to need is a scripts collection, since this is an externally referenced script. And if you're thinking that this won't work because of an omission back in my script file, you're right. Just hold on a sec. So here we're going to add a scripts reference, and we're just going to set up the path, and we're going to pick the one that we want, which is, in our case, scripts ASP.NET services. So we're going to close this tag. But if you've played around with trying to include externally referenced scripts, you know that we need to send a signal to the script manager while we're doing this. So one more thing we need to do here is we need to say if type of sys is not equal to undefined, sys dot application dot notify script loaded. Okay, so now we can just telling the script manager that our custom script is loaded. Now, okay, so where we're at so far is we've got authentication. We've got our authentication database set up with a user that we can authenticate with. We've got our calls to the authentication service login method all set up in our JavaScript file. We've included that JavaScript file into our application here. Now we're ready to continue programming. The first thing that I'm going to do is we're going to add another web service, or add our first web service, I should say. And we're going to do this just because what we're going to do for the scenario in this little application here is we're going to let the user authenticate from the default.aspx page, but they don't have to be authenticated to go there. But they will have to be authenticated to make AJAX service method calls. So to do that, we're going to need a service method call that will require authentication. And so to do that, we're going to have to decorate our class by saying imports system dot web dot script dot services, and now I can come down here and say, hey, this is a script service, meaning I want you to let this be callable through JavaScript. So I want the script manager and the ASP.NET AJAX extensions to generate JavaScript proxies to this service. And now we don't want to call this hello world, so let's just call it call method. Now we're going to let this method be called, but we're not going to do anything if the user that's calling this method is not an authenticated user. So to make that determination, we're going to say if user identity is authenticated. Now, if you've done any programming against forms-based authentication, you know what this object is about. Not only can we find out whether or not they're authenticated, we can find out what role they're in. So, for example, we might return one set of results if the user is an authenticated user, and a different set of results if the user is an authenticated administrator, for example. Really powerful functionality that's just built in. And we're going to return something. We're going to change what something is here momentarily. And we're also going to say else. Now, if we hit else, that means that the user is not authenticated. So we might return nothing. We might return a message that says, you know, hey, pay your membership or whatever you want. We're just going to return, in the case of this demo, invalid user. And so here, if the user is validated, we're going to do whatever this web service is supposed to do. So we're going to, you know, query the database, or, you know, grab some content, or whatever it is that an authenticated user should get. Right? And that's all we need to do in our web service. Now back over in our default.aspx, we're going to need a services collection so that we can call that service. All right. So let's just create an async service reference. And we'll just specify the path equal web service, and that's all we need. Now we just need a little UI and a little JavaScript on the client side to handle a calling mechanism, and we'll be good to test. Okay, so down here, I'm going to start by making sure this content is centered. And now I'm going to make this div identifiable just because I'm going to add a little bit of behavior that's an indicator as to what's going on, just for the sake of demonstration purposes. So let's call this div login div. This is where we're going to have our actual login stuff. And let's assign a CSS class of login div just for formatting purposes. Now we're going to have a couple of inputs, and these are going to be HTML inputs. This is all going to be, you know, real AJAX client-side logic implemented in JavaScript. So let's add a text box and a password box and a button. All right, and now let's configure those. So we're going to want, oops. So we're going to want some breaks after each of those. And let's make names more useful. So text, username, and text password. And I know for you folks that are chuckling that I'm still using old style notation. I can't break myself of the habit. Let's also add a little text here. Let's say username, and here we'll say password, and let's change this to be button login. Value login. And for you really visually inclined folks, let's go ahead and see what we've got so far. Alright, so do a little spacing. I'm going to click on the login button to get a a little JavaScript handler there generated. Now we still got a little bit more to do here. Outside the form, we're going to add a little bit more content here. So let's center this as well. And here we're going to need another input button. Now, this input button up here, this is to perform the authentication, the login. This one down here is going to be the user predicate for some web service calls. So this doesn't have to be a button. It could be a timer or a mouse over or a selection in a drop-down list or really whatever you want. And the value, so we'll say call a protected web service. Now remember, our web service code says, hey, if the user is not authenticated, then tell them that's an invalid user. If the user is authenticated, then go ahead and do what you're supposed to do. Okay, so I just generated a JavaScript event handler for that button click event. In addition to the button, we're going to want a place we can stuff content based on the return from that web service call. So let's add a div, and we'll give it an ID of call content. And now we can write our JavaScript code. So for button login, we're going to call our doLogin method, which is here. All right. Now remember, we're not going to do anything client side relative to the success or failure of the login. You absolutely could set content on the page that says your login is successful, enable and disable the web service method call button. So you can get pretty clever in terms of what you can do based on the state of successful or failure, success or failure with the login. In our case, we're just leaving the method return shelled out there. So we're going to call doLogin. All right. So let's say do login, and note now we've got IntelliSense because we've included a reference. We now have IntelliSense to the custom code that we've written in our ASP.NET Service JavaScript file, and we're going to have to pass in a username and a password. So we're going to say get text username dot value. And we're going to do the same thing for the password field. Now remember that this doLogin is an asynchronous, calls an asynchronous function. So in doLogin, we're calling an asynchronous function. So this is going to return right away. And just so we can see what the, just so that we can see what's happening, I'm going to add a little behavior. Get element by ID, and we're going to turn that login div off. Right, so what I'm doing here is that login div where we have the username password field, I'm going to empty that. And I'm going to set the class to nothing, just so you don't see the border that's there by default. So, right, so the login field will disappear. Now, remember, that's going to disappear automatically. In our case, we're not going to do any determination as to whether or not the login was successful. In your app, what you probably want to do is have a little logic in there that says, "Hey, only disappear the login box if the login was successful." All right, and I'm doing this manually for the sake of demonstration. You might use any number of different authentication mechanisms in terms of how you're going to communicate with the authentication service. Of course, if you're doing this for user authentication in a full-blown web application, you might choose to use the login controls that are provided in ASP.NET. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do, now this will cause our login to process. The next thing we got to do is when this button gets clicked down at the bottom to call a web service, the one that says, "Hey, is the user logged in or not?" Then we're going to call web service dot call method. And all we really care about is on complete, on error. And for you VB programmers, remember that this is JavaScript, so case matters. And then we need the function handlers, so obviously you're going to want to do some real error handling in your applications. And here we're just going to say if return is equal to invalid user. Right, so this I'm doing some more client-side checking. You don't necessarily have to do this if you're just returning, you could just return a message that says, "Hey, the user's not authenticated. You have to log in before you can do this function." In our case, we're just going to check for that static text here client-side. So we just want to check and see, hey, if this is what got returned, then the user needs to log in. All right, so again, good deal of flexibility. Sort of, one of the advantages of JavaScript is that, although it doesn't have the sort of classical engineering elegance of a language like C# or C++, it does have some flexibility. All right, so we're going to say, is it an invalid user? Else do something else. In our case, we're just going to populate that div. So, and of course, you can use the client-side shorthand, this get mechanism. I just been programming JavaScript a long time, so in this instance, I sort of forgot. So here's the div that we want to populate. And we're going to set the inner HTML element equal to, and here we're going to give them a message, right? So you are not authenticated for web service calls. But if they are, and we'll just say show whatever the web service returned. All right, now let's build, see if we have any coding mistakes. Now let's go ahead and try and run. Now I will mention, when you click the login button, if you get an error that says something about the authentication service with a web service not being defined, you want to make sure that the service references exist in your web.config file. So the easiest way to do that is just to compare the one that you're having the problem with the one that's that you can download in the sample code for this demo. So let's enter a fake username and password. Right now, remember, we're not actually doing anything in the UI to validate authentication. All we can do here is we've successfully called the authentication service, but that's not a valid user, so we're not going to honor their requests. However, if we go back and enter a valid user and password, and then we log in, now we call that service and we get valid user content. So hopefully this gives you an idea on how to get started using forms-based authentication. Couple of things to remember here. We're just using the authentication mechanism to determine how we want to handle the service method call, but once the user is validated, you can use that user is validated object for all kinds of decisions relative to what you're going to show the user and what you're going to allow them to do. The other thing to remember is that here in our script code, right, we have you have the ability right here to make decisions about what you're going to do based on the client side at authentication time, if the authentication is successful or not. So you have that authentication state in the JavaScript code on the client as well as in the user object on the server, which makes it a very powerful construct for doing user-specific or authenticated user-specific functionality in your application. The one last thing to remember about this is that while this authentication mechanism will deny unauthenticated users from accessing your AJAX service methods, those credentials are passed over the wire in clear text. So if you're really interested in sort of higher end security, you have to do that authentication through SSL or use one of the other more secure mechanisms. But hopefully this helps, and now you can get started using forms-based authentication in your ASP.NET AJAX applications.